Tom Henderson was just an ordinary guy, living an ordinary life in the quiet, middle-class suburb of Glenwood. At 42 years old, he had settled into a routine that was as predictable as the seasons themselves. He woke up every morning at 6:30 a.m. to the shrill alarm that had long since lost its sting. His wife, Laura, always beat him to the kitchen, preparing breakfast while humming along to the soft music playing in the background. The kids, Catherine, 17, and Ben, 14, were still in their rooms, their teenage lives consumed by schoolwork and social media. For Tom, life was about stability. He worked as a regional sales manager at a company that sold commercial plumbing supplies. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. It wasn't a job that excited him anymore, but it paid the bills, and that was all that mattered. He had made peace with his career, knowing he would never be a millionaire or a revolutionary businessman. He had friends in the same position, and the neighborhood was full of people who just wanted to survive the daily grind, providing for their families and making it through another week. That morning was like any other. Tom kissed Laura goodbye as she packed his lunch, turkey and Swiss sandwich, no mayo, just mustard, and headed out the door. The drive to work was uneventful, the usual traffic on the same streets, the same faces at the traffic lights. Tom had long ago stopped feeling frustrated by the daily commute. It was just part of life, something you had to endure. He didn't dream of change. He didn't even really want it. The monotony was a comfort to him, a sign that life was stable, predictable, manageable. When he arrived at the office, the day was off to a familiar start. Tom sat at his desk, flipping through emails, answering client queries, and reviewing sales reports that all blended together. He'd been in this position for over a decade, and although he had once aspired to climb higher in the company, he had long since given up on that dream. The people above him had their own ambitions, and they were content to leave him in his place. Tom had learned not to rock the boat. He did his job well enough to avoid scrutiny and went home each night with just enough energy to watch a little TV before heading to bed. It was during lunch when the first hint of change arrived, though Tom didn't recognize it at the time. He'd decided to walk to a local deli, a small, cozy place with faded red booths and a long counter. It wasn't fancy, but it had good sandwiches and a friendly atmosphere. As he walked in, he waved at the owner, Jimmy, who had been running the place for years. Jimmy had been a fixture in the neighborhood for decades, and Tom had visited the deli so often that they'd exchanged stories about their families and talked sports over the years. "How's the family, Tom?" Jimmy asked, sliding a menu across the counter. "Good, good," Tom replied, as he scanned the menu absent-mindedly. Same old, same old." He grinned, but it felt forced, even to him. Jimmy smiled back, though Tom could tell there was something off in his expression. "I hear you're doing well at work, huh?" Jimmy said, lowering his voice slightly as he leaned in. "Heard you're up for a promotion." Tom paused, surprised. He hadn't heard anything about a promotion, and the idea that his job might change felt uncomfortable. "Promotion?" he repeated, almost laughing at the idea. "Nah, that's not me. I'm just getting by." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You're not just getting by, Tom. You're solid. People notice." Tom chuckled, but inside, a seed of doubt was planted. He hadn't thought about career advancement in years, but now, the thought lingered. He paid for his sandwich and sat down at a booth, the faint sounds of the bustling deli surrounding him. As he bit into his sandwich, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He dismissed it, though. It was probably just a slow day at work, or maybe he was just feeling restless. The rest of the afternoon dragged on in its usual monotony. Tom was putting in another long day at the office when he received an unexpected email from his boss, Mark Whitmore. The subject line was simple: urgent, request for a meeting. Tom's stomach tightened as he clicked open the email. Mark rarely contacted him outside of their weekly check-ins, and the tone of the message was formal, almost cold. "Tom," the email began. "I need you to come in tomorrow morning for a special meeting. Please ensure you're prepared to discuss your future with the company." Tom stared at the screen, his mind racing. "My future with the company?" he murmured to himself. What did that even mean? He felt his heartbeat quicken. The idea of discussing his future at work, something he had never truly considered, suddenly felt overwhelming. What if they were firing him? What if they were going to offer him a promotion and expected him to make a life-changing decision? He couldn't process it, not yet. It was a feeling he didn't like, the kind of anxiety that comes with uncertainty. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. He went home, ate dinner with Laura, and tried to push the thought of the meeting out of his mind, but it lingered like a shadow. As he climbed into bed, he tossed and turned, unable to quiet his thoughts. What if this meeting changed everything? What if he was about to be faced with a choice that would force him to alter the course of his life? The next morning, Tom arrived at the office early, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He tried to go through his usual routine, but the thought of the meeting consumed him. When he entered the conference room, he was greeted by Mark and a few others from HR, their faces unreadable. Tom took a seat, his palms sweating. He had no idea what was coming. "Tom," Mark began, looking at him with an expression that was hard to read. "Thank you for coming in. We've been reviewing your performance, and we think you're capable of more than just this regional role. We want to offer you an opportunity, one that will require a significant commitment." Tom's heart raced. Was this a promotion? But before he could say anything, Mark continued. "This opportunity will take you outside of your comfort zone, Tom. We're offering you the chance to be part of a groundbreaking experiment in a new market. It's a high-risk, high-reward situation, and we need someone who can think outside the box." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Tom blinked, unsure whether to feel excitement or dread. A groundbreaking experiment? Risk and reward? It sounded like something out of a business magazine, not his life. Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But, Tom," he said, lowering his voice. "There's one catch. It's going to require a level of sacrifice, personal and professional, that you may not be ready for. Are you willing to take that leap?" Tom's stomach dropped. He wasn't sure what Mark was asking, but he knew one thing: this decision would change everything. But Mark wasn't done. "We've already set up the framework. We have the resources. All we need is someone who's willing to live the life, to immerse themselves in it. You'll be given a new identity, a backstory, everything. You'll blend in with those who have nothing and see how they survive. We'll monitor you, of course, but you'll have to be fully committed. This will be no easy task, Tom." As the words settled into his mind, Tom felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. It wasn't just a job. It was an experiment in human nature, in the power dynamics of society, in the stark divide between those who have everything and those who have nothing. But the more Tom thought about it, the more the challenge appealed to him. This wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder anymore. This was about doing something that no one had ever done before, stepping into a world so foreign, so uncomfortable, that it would change him forever. Mark's eyes softened as if sensing Tom's internal struggle. "I won't lie, Tom. It's going to be hard. You'll lose everything, your home, your family life, your connections. But we'll make sure you're protected. No one will know who you really are. The experience will be transformative, but it will also come with risks. Are you prepared for that?" Tom didn't respond immediately. He felt as if the room had grown smaller, the walls closing in on him. The weight of the decision pressed down like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. But deep down, a part of him knew that this was his moment. This was his chance to break free from the endless cycle of mediocrity that had defined his existence for so long. Laura had always joked about Tom's midlife crisis, about how he sometimes talked about wanting to do something big, something meaningful. She always dismissed it as just talk, something he said when he felt restless after a tough week. But this was different. This wasn't just a passing thought or a fantasy. It was a real opportunity, one that could change everything. But it also meant walking away from everything he knew. Tom's mind raced through the potential consequences. What would his family think? What would they do if he disappeared for weeks or months, living as a stranger in a world they couldn't understand? But then again, how could he say no to something so extraordinary? How could he live with the knowledge that he had a chance to do something meaningful and not take it? Tom closed his eyes for a moment, and in the silence of the room, he heard the faintest whisper of his own voice, "You have to do this." "All right," he said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I'm in." Mark's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, satisfaction, perhaps, passed across his face. "Good. You won't regret this, Tom. I promise you." That was the moment that everything shifted. Tom didn't know it then, but his life as he knew it was over. He had just made a decision that would take him down a. Tom didn't know it then, but his life as he knew it was over. He had just made a decision that would take him down a path from which the next few days were a blur of preparations. Tom was given a new name, a fabricated backstory, and even a set of new clothes that made him look every bit the part of a man who had fallen on hard times. He was told to get rid of his phone and his credit cards, everything that tied him to his old life. The company had set up a new apartment for him in a rundown part of the city, an area where the homeless population was prevalent and largely ignored. He was told to leave his car at a nearby parking garage and to walk everywhere. It was a strange sensation, this act of shedding his old identity. For the first time in years, Tom felt like he was walking into the unknown, his life unmoored from everything that had given it structure. But it wasn't fear he felt, it was exhilaration. The feeling of freedom, of stepping away from everything he had ever known, was intoxicating. As the days passed, Tom grew accustomed to his new life, or at least to the external trappings of it. The deeper emotional toll, however, was yet to come. His first night on the streets, sitting on a bench beneath a flickering street lamp, was more uncomfortable than anything he had ever experienced. The cold bit at his skin, and the hunger gnawed at him. The world felt crueler now, harsher. But still, he pressed on. This wasn't supposed to be easy. He had chosen this path, and now there was no turning back. What he didn't know yet, however, was that the lines between his real life and this new life were beginning to blur. And before long, he would find himself trapped in a world that was far more dangerous and complicated than he could have ever imagined. He might never return. The first few days were manageable, but Tom quickly realized that he had underestimated the harshness of life on the streets. What had seemed like an exciting challenge, the chance to see life through a new lens, to understand the plight of those who had nothing, soon became an overwhelming and humbling experience. The streets were a world unto themselves, one that operated under its own rules, where survival wasn't just about food and shelter, but about understanding the subtle dynamics of power, trust, and deception. His first night sleeping on the cold concrete was enough to shake him. Tom had assumed he would be able to sleep through the discomfort, like he did through a bad night at home on a lumpy mattress, but he was wrong. The noise of the city never stopped, sirens wailing, car alarms blaring, people shouting in the distance. He huddled beneath a thin blanket, his body stiff with cold, his mind racing with thoughts of his family, his comfortable life back in the suburbs. He thought of Laura's warm smile, Ben's teenage sarcasm, and Catherine's quiet intelligence. He hadn't realized just how much he took those moments for granted until they were gone. But even worse than the physical discomfort was the gnawing sense of isolation. The streets were populated with people, but they might as well have been invisible. No one looked at him, not really. People passed by, their eyes skimming over him like he was just another piece of urban scenery. They were too busy with their own lives, their own struggles, to see him as anything other than a part of the background. And yet, he couldn't help but feel the weight of every ignored glance, every second of invisibility. Tom had always been someone who prided himself on being seen. His job, his family, his place in the community, everything about his life had been visible, acknowledged, validated. Now, here he was, a ghost in the city. He started to wonder how many others felt the same way, how many people lived their lives unnoticed, unacknowledged, just scraping by, existing but never truly living. By the third day, Tom's sense of self-worth was starting to erode. The company had given him a new identity, a backstory to explain his presence on the streets. His name was now Rick, and his life was a tragic one. He had lost his job, his family, his home, and had nowhere left to turn but the street. It was a believable story, one that would get him sympathy from some, disdain from others. But the more he lived this new identity, the more it felt like a trap. The line between who he had been and who he was now started to blur, and he didn't know where one ended and the other began. He spent his days moving from park benches to soup kitchens, from abandoned buildings to the corners of busy intersections, trying to blend in, trying to observe the world around him without drawing attention. He learned quickly that survival meant more than just finding food, it meant knowing where to go for help, knowing who to trust, and understanding the hidden hierarchies that ruled the streets. There were those who were on the fringes of society, like him, but then there were those who had fallen deeper, those who had been hardened by years of struggle and pain. These people were not to be trifled with. Tom learned this lesson the hard way. One afternoon, he sat outside a rundown deli, watching the people pass by. A man, older than Tom but with the same weary look in his eyes, approached him. His clothes were torn, his face lined with age and hard living. He didn't ask for anything. Instead, he sat down beside Tom and stared out at the street, as if trying to take in the entire scene before him. Tom didn't know what to make of him at first. He was a stranger, after all, but there was something about the man that seemed familiar. After a few minutes of silence, the man spoke. "Hey, you're new here, right?" His voice was rough, but it carried an air of knowing, of experience. Tom hesitated. He had been instructed to keep his head down, to remain under the radar. But something about the man's presence made him feel like he could trust him. "Yeah, I guess you could say that," Tom replied cautiously. The man nodded, looking Tom up and down, sizing him up. "You don't look like you've been out here long. Let me guess, lost your job? Wife kick you out? Happens to a lot of us. But it's not the losing that's the problem, it's what happens after." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't told anyone his backstory, but this man had seen right through it. His eyes were sharp, as though he could tell exactly who Tom was, or at least who he was pretending to be. "What happens after?" Tom asked, almost without thinking. The man gave a hollow laugh. "You lose yourself. The first thing to go is your pride. Then, the rest follows. You start to forget who you were before. Start to think this is all you're ever going to be. It's the worst part of it all, really. Because once you forget, you stop trying to get out. And that's when you really become part of the street." Tom swallowed hard. He had known, deep down, that this was going to be difficult, but the reality of it was more than he had bargained for. He had thought he was just playing a role, living a life that wasn't his, temporarily inhabiting a world he could easily walk away from. But the longer he spent on the streets, the more he began to question everything, his choices, his identity, his entire life. How long would he be able to keep pretending? As days turned into weeks, Tom began to see the streets in a different light. He noticed the same faces, day after day, each one a reflection of a different story. Some people were hardened and angry, others lost in the haze of addiction, while some seemed to have given up entirely. But there were others, too, the ones who managed to hold on to a glimmer of hope, a sense of community. He met people who had their own secret networks, who shared tips on where to find the best food or the safest place to sleep. One of these people was a woman named Sarah. She was in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and a quick wit. She had been on the streets for over a year, ever since her abusive partner had thrown her out, and despite everything, she had managed to survive with a combination of street smarts and sheer willpower. Sarah was the first person to talk to Tom like he wasn't invisible, like he was still someone worth speaking to. "You're still holding on to something," Sarah said one evening as they sat near a small fire in a dilapidated alley. "I can tell. Most people, when they get here, they let go. But not you. You're still trying to keep some part of your old life intact. It won't work. You've gotta let go. Or else you'll drown in it." Her words echoed in Tom's mind long after the conversation ended. He couldn't help but wonder if she was right. Was he still trying to hold on to something that didn't exist anymore? Was he trying to be someone he wasn't? Every time he looked in the mirror, well, when he could find a mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. His face had grown gaunt, his clothes were dirty and worn, and his posture was hunched from sleeping in alleyways. But it wasn't just his appearance that had changed, it was his mind, his soul. He had begun to think like the people around him. Survival had become his sole focus. His old life, the one he had once believed was so secure, felt like a distant memory. But what was he really surviving for? Was it just to make it another day, another week, in the cold, hard reality of the streets? Or was there something deeper, something more meaningful waiting for him, if he could find the strength to claw his way out of this life? The questions haunted him, as did the strange mix of fear and determination that was starting to grow inside him. And then, just when he thought he had reached the breaking point, something happened. Something that would force Tom to make a choice, one that would alter not only his life, but the lives of those around him. He couldn't know it then, but this moment was the beginning of the real test. The true challenge had just begun. Tom was no longer sure of the days or the weeks. Time had become fluid, blurred by the monotony of survival. He no longer counted the hours by the setting sun or the ticking of a clock, but by the small milestones: finding a meal, securing a spot to sleep without being disturbed, managing to stay out of the reach of the street gangs that ruled certain corners of the city. It wasn't that he had given up on his mission, he hadn't, but the challenge of maintaining his cover, of keeping up the facade of a man with no future, was wearing him down. Each day felt like it was pulling him deeper into a pit from which there would be no escape. The hunger, the physical toll, the emotional strain of constantly being on alert, everything was eating away at him. And yet, there was a strange, undeniable truth to what he had been experiencing. The longer he lived as Rick, the more he understood the complexities of the human condition. His original goal had been to immerse himself in the world of homelessness for a business experiment, to see how society responded to people like him. But now, as the days turned into weeks, Tom found himself more and more disconnected from the person he used to be, and the lines between his true self and the persona he had crafted began to blur. It was on the 15th day that Tom reached his breaking point. He had just spent the last few hours in a soup kitchen, trying to blend in, trying to observe the people around him as they ate their meager portions. He had been careful to keep his head down, just another face in the crowd, just another nameless soul among many. But the moment he stepped outside into the harsh daylight, it felt as though the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. The city was bustling around him, but it all seemed so far away, so distant. He was a part of it, and yet he wasn't. The streets were cold, unforgiving, and every corner he turned seemed to echo with the relentless reminder that he had no place here. He hadn't expected the moment to come. It had crept up on him like an unseen predator, gnawing at the edges of his mind, pushing him closer to the edge. But now that it was here, there was no denying it, Tom was lost. Not just physically lost, but emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly seen, the last time someone had acknowledged his existence beyond the fact that he was just another person on the street. And the loneliness was suffocating. It wasn't just the physical isolation, the being ignored by passers-by, it was the sense that the world had moved on, leaving him behind. He wasn't just homeless, he felt utterly disconnected from everything that had once mattered to him. His phone, which he had been instructed to discard, had become a lifeline of sorts, an anchor to the life he had left behind. But he hadn't used it in days. Each time he thought about calling Laura, about hearing her voice, the guilt washed over him. He had promised her he would be okay, that he would come back. But what kind of man was he, if he couldn't even survive on the streets for more than a few weeks? What would she think if she knew the truth, that he was no longer the man she had married, that he was drowning in this alternate existence? He walked aimlessly, no destination in mind, just trying to quiet the storm inside his head. He turned a corner, hoping for some distraction, when he noticed a group of men gathered around a storefront. They were laughing, shouting, acting like they owned the place. As he drew closer, Tom realized that they were part of a local gang, one that controlled a large section of the area. He had been warned about them, how they operated, how they preyed on the vulnerable. They were the kind of people who didn't just ignore you if you were down on your luck, they took advantage of it. As Tom moved past them, one of the men spotted him and let out a low whistle. "Hey, you. You got a problem," the man sneered, his eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. Tom froze, instinctively retreating into himself, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. But it was no use. The man was already closing in. "Not from around here, huh? What's your deal?" The man's voice was sharp, dangerous. Tom could see the flicker of amusement in his eyes as he sized him up. It wasn't curiosity, it was something more predatory. "I'm just trying to get by," Tom mumbled, his heart pounding in his chest. The man grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Trying to get by? This is our turf, man. You don't get to just wander around here without paying the price." Tom tried to back away, but the man was quick, grabbing him by the collar of his tattered jacket and slamming him against the wall. His breath was hot on Tom's face as he sneered. "You think you're just gonna walk through life unnoticed? Think again. You're gonna pay up if you want to keep breathing." Panic surged in Tom's chest. He hadn't signed up for this. He hadn't signed up to be a victim, to be preyed upon in a world where no one cared. He could feel the blood draining from his face as the man's grip tightened. In that moment, Tom felt more powerless than he had ever felt in his life. The world had stripped him of everything, his dignity, his safety, his control. There was no fight left in him. But then, something inside him snapped. He had made a choice, to survive, to play this game, to see how far he could go before the lines between Rick and Tom completely dissolved. But as he looked into the eyes of the man holding him against the wall, something changed. His old self, the man who had once been confident, secure in his role in the world, fought its way back to the surface. He wasn't just some weak, desperate man to be taken advantage of. He was Tom, he was someone with the strength to push back. Without thinking, Tom twisted his body, using his remaining strength to break free from the man's grip. He shoved the man off him, sending him stumbling back. The other members of the gang stepped forward, ready to join in, but Tom's heart was racing with adrenaline now. He was terrified, but he wasn't going to let them see it. "You don't control me," he spat, his voice hoarse but filled with an intensity he hadn't known he had. "I'm not afraid of you." For a brief moment, there was silence. The gang members were taken aback, unsure of how to respond. But it didn't last long. One of them, the tallest of the group, lunged at Tom, grabbing him by the arm and trying to pull him back into the fray. But before he could do anything, a voice rang out from the other side of the street. "Hey! Leave him alone." It was Sarah. Tom recognized her immediately, her sharp eyes locked on the scene. She marched toward them, her stance confident and unyielding. "You want to mess with someone?" "Mess with me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The gang members hesitated. They clearly weren't expecting this. Tom's heart hammered in his chest, his breath ragged as he watched Sarah square off against them. She wasn't backing down, not in the slightest. The leader of the gang, the man who had initially confronted Tom, sneered at her but seemed to think better of pushing things further. With a last glare at Tom, he nodded to his group, signaling that it was time to go. "You're lucky, old man," the leader muttered, backing off. "This ain't over." And with that, they disappeared into the shadows, leaving Tom and Sarah standing there, the tension in the air palpable. Tom stood there for a moment, his legs trembling, his mind still processing what had just happened. He had survived. But at what cost? "You all right?" Sarah asked, her voice softening as she looked him up and down. She gave him a once-over before adding, "You've got a fire in you, after all." Tom didn't know what to say. For the first time since this all began, he felt a surge of something other than fear, other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was a spark. A spark that told him he wasn't completely lost. I don't know," he whispered. "I thought I was. But now, I'm not so sure." Sarah nodded. "You'll figure it out. We all do, eventually." She gave him a crooked smile, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Tom stood there for a long moment, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions he felt. He had almost lost himself. He had been on the verge of completely giving up. But now, something was shifting inside him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting back. The question, though, was whether he could keep it up. Whether he could find his way back to the man he used to be, or if he would forever remain lost in this world that had swallowed him whole. The days following the encounter with the gang were a blur. Tom felt like he had crossed some invisible threshold, a point of no return. For the first time in weeks, he began to feel something other than the oppressive weight of survival. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He wasn't just trying to exist anymore. He was fighting to reclaim some part of himself that he thought had been lost forever. He began to walk with more purpose, his steps no longer hesitant, no longer unsure. The world was still cold and indifferent, but now Tom had something to hold on to, a flicker of defiance, a spark of strength that he hadn't known he still had. His first encounter with Sarah had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. There was something about her confidence, her unflinching refusal to back down, that resonated deep within him. It was strange. Sarah, who had been out here for so long, seemed to have mastered something Tom hadn't yet figured out, how to survive without letting it consume you. She had become a part of the street, but not in the way the others had. She wasn't broken. She wasn't giving up. And in some strange way, that made Tom want to fight harder, to push himself further than he ever thought possible. The thing that kept gnawing at him, though, was the truth of his situation. His life, the one he had known before all of this, was still out there, just beyond his reach. He could still remember his house, his family, his job. He could almost feel the comfort of his old life, as if it were a dream he could wake up from at any moment. But the longer he stayed in this strange, new reality, the more it felt like that life had slipped away from him, and he wasn't sure if he could ever return to it. And then there was the company. The reason he had come here in the first place. He had been sent undercover to experience life on the streets, to report back, to gather information for some project. That's how it had all started. That's what had motivated him to step out of his comfortable existence. But now, as the days dragged on and his sense of self became more and more fragmented, Tom found it harder and harder to remember why he had agreed to this in the first place. What was the point? Was it worth it? Was it worth losing his sense of identity, his dignity, his very humanity? The reality of his situation came crashing down one evening, when Tom was huddled on a bench in a park, trying to sleep. It was late, and the city was quieter than usual. The cold had seeped into his bones, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He wasn't sure what it was, whether it was instinct or some deep, buried awareness, but he felt like he was standing at the edge of a precipice, and all it would take was one step to plunge him into the unknown. And then it came, the call. His phone, which he had kept hidden for the past few weeks, buzzed in his pocket. He had almost forgotten about it. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled it out, his hands shaking slightly. It was a text message, from Laura. "Tom, I don't know how to reach you. Ben's been asking about you, and I don't know what to tell him. I don't know if you're okay, or if you're coming home. Please, if you can, just let me know that you're alive. We miss you." Tom stared at the message, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. For a moment, he was paralyzed. He wanted to respond, to tell her everything, to let her know he was still here, still alive, still holding on. But something stopped him. The guilt, the shame, the fear of what he had become, it all came rushing back in a wave. How could he explain this to her? How could he tell her that he had disappeared, that he had left everything behind, that he was living on the streets, pretending to be someone else? He ran his fingers over the screen, his mind racing. A part of him wanted to call her, to hear her voice, to feel the connection to the life he had abandoned. But another part of him, the part that had been on the streets for so long, hesitated. Was it too late to go back? Had he crossed a line from which there would be no return? Was he already too far gone to step back into the life he had known? The phone buzzed again, a second message. This time, it was from his boss at the company. The message was short, blunt. "Tom, we need your report. It's time to wrap this up." The weight of the message was like a physical blow. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. His reason for being here, for pretending to be someone else, had finally caught up with him. He was expected to turn in his report, to deliver his findings, to finish the assignment he had been sent on. It wasn't about the streets anymore. It wasn't about the people he had met or the experiences he had lived through. It was about the bottom line. It was about the project. Tom stared at the screen, his thoughts swirling. He could send the report. He could finish the mission. He could walk away from the streets, from Rick, from the pain and the struggle of the past few weeks, and go back to the life he had known before all of this began. He could go back to being Tom, a man with a job, a family, a future. The company would get what they wanted, and he could leave all of this behind. But could he? The question lingered in his mind, nagging at him, demanding an answer. Could he really walk away from this? Could he leave behind the people he had met, the lessons he had learned, the truth he had uncovered? Could he forget what it felt like to be Rick, to experience the world from the bottom up, to see the cracks in society that no one ever acknowledged? Was it even possible to just erase this part of himself? He looked around the park, at the people who passed by, some of them on their way to work, some of them with nowhere else to go. His eyes landed on a young woman sitting on the steps of a nearby building, clutching a shopping bag to her chest. She looked like she was waiting for something or someone. She had the same lost look in her eyes that Tom had seen in so many others. He could feel her pain, her uncertainty. She was alone, like he had been. Like he still was. Tom thought about his family. He thought about Laura, about Ben, about his old life. He thought about the warmth of home, the comfort of knowing that he had a place in the world, a purpose. But he also thought about the people on the streets, Sarah, the homeless man who had tried to show him the ropes, the old woman who had given him a spare sandwich when he was starving. They had all been through things he couldn't even begin to understand. They had been abandoned, forgotten, and yet they kept going. They fought every day to survive. Tom didn't know what to do. The decision he faced now wasn't just about going back to his old life or finishing the assignment. It was about something deeper, something more profound. He wasn't just deciding whether to return to his family. He was deciding who he wanted to be, who he was meant to be. Could he continue living the lie, finishing the mission and reporting back to the company, knowing that he had learned something that could change everything? Or would he step into a new life, a new identity, and leave behind the comfortable, predictable world he had always known? The decision seemed impossible. And then, just as he was about to put the phone down, a voice broke through the silence. "You coming?" Tom turned around, startled. It was Sarah. She had returned to the park, her eyes scanning the crowd as if she had been searching for him. Tom started to say, but his words caught in his throat. "You look like you're thinking too hard," she said with a half-smile. "Come on. You're not alone in this." For the first time in a long time, Tom felt something shift. He wasn't alone anymore. Not in this. Not in life. And that, perhaps, was the most important choice of all. The morning after Sarah's unexpected appearance at the park, Tom woke with a strange feeling in his chest. He didn't know exactly what it was, relief or dread, hope or fear, but whatever it was, it had settled in deep. It felt like the quiet before a storm, the calm before everything changed. He had made the decision to meet her, to walk beside her for a while, and now he was beginning to realize the weight of what that decision might mean. The choice that Tom faced wasn't just about his immediate future. It wasn't even about going back to his old life or continuing his mission. It was about his soul, his humanity, and the moral crossroads he found himself at. It was about what kind of person he wanted to be, whether he would allow the streets to break him and swallow him whole, or whether he would fight, not just for his survival, but for something larger, something greater. Sarah had been right in some ways. There was no going back. But there was something about her calm, resolute nature that made Tom believe that the only way forward was through the struggle. She had faced the depths of despair, had seen the worst of what the world had to offer, and yet, somehow, she had not only survived, it was as if she had found a way to live in spite of everything. Sarah wasn't just existing, she was carving out a life on her terms, in a world that had long since abandoned her. That afternoon, they sat on the same park bench again, watching the world go by. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sarah spoke little but said everything with her eyes, eyes that had seen it all, eyes that knew too much about the harsh reality of the world. She had been the first to show him what survival really meant, and now, she was showing him how to find something worth fighting for amidst all the chaos. But even as Tom tried to understand the lessons she was offering, another part of him, a deeper, more troubled part, kept tugging him back toward his original purpose. The company was waiting for his report. They had given him an assignment, and whether he liked it or not, he had a responsibility. But the more time he spent on the streets, the more distant that responsibility seemed. The more he lived the life of someone who had nothing, the less he cared about the world he had come from. As he sat beside Sarah, Tom realized that the company he had worked for, the people he had once trusted, were nothing more than distant memories, like an old photograph fading with time. He wasn't sure he cared about the report anymore, about the lies he had told, about the game he had been a part of. What did it all matter now? The system, the hierarchy, the competition, none of it had seemed so important since he had stepped into this world of strangers and survival. At the same time, he couldn't completely shake the gnawing doubt that had been with him from the beginning. What would happen when they found out he had disappeared? What would happen if they found out what he had seen, what he had experienced? Could he keep pretending to be someone else? Could he continue the charade indefinitely? Later that evening, as Sarah and Tom were wandering through the streets looking for somewhere to sleep, they crossed paths with an older man. He was sitting in the doorway of an abandoned building, wrapped in layers of tattered clothes, his face creased with age and hardship. He looked at them with a certain understanding, as though he had seen it all before. "Looking for a place to sleep?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Tom nodded. Yeah, it's getting cold tonight. The man studied them for a long moment, then sighed. You know, it wasn't always like this, he said. There was a time when I had a home, a job, a family. I had a future. I don't know where it went. One day I was living my life, and the next, well, here I am. He looked out across the dark street, as if seeing something no one else could. It happens to all of us, sooner or later. Tom felt a pang in his chest. He knew what the man was saying, even if he didn't want to admit it. He had spent so many years chasing after something, success, security, status, that he had never stopped to think about what really mattered. It wasn't just about making money or climbing the corporate ladder. It wasn't about living in a big house or having a fancy car. He had been so focused on achieving the next goal that he had lost sight of everything else. And now, here he was, a man without a place, without a future. A man who had nothing, not even a name that wasn't a lie. As they moved on, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Not just for himself, but for the man they had just met. For all the others he had seen on the streets. The homeless, the forgotten, the ones who had once been like him, people who had lived ordinary lives until something knocked them off course. Some had made choices that led them down dark paths, others had been victims of circumstances beyond their control. But in the end, they all had one thing in common: they had lost everything. They spent the night on the cold, hard ground under an old bridge, their bodies huddled together for warmth. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the silence of the night, Tom lay awake, thinking about everything he had learned over the past few weeks. The people he had met, the things he had seen, the questions that had begun to form in his mind. He realized something profound: the streets had shown him a different world, a world he had never truly understood until now. It wasn't just about survival, it was about resilience. It was about finding meaning in the face of hardship. It was about finding a way to keep going, even when the world had given up on you. The next day, as they made their way back toward the city, Tom's phone buzzed again. It was another message from his boss. This time, there was no question. Just a directive: Tom, we need the final report. Now. It was the moment he had been dreading. The moment when he would have to decide whether to return to the world he had left behind or to embrace the life he had found here, on the streets, with people who had shown him what it meant to live with dignity, even in the darkest of circumstances. He looked at the phone, his finger hovering over the screen, unsure of what to do. For the first time in weeks, he felt something stir inside him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or hope, but it didn't matter. He knew that this decision, this moment, was going to define him. It wasn't just about going back to his old life. It was about who he wanted to be. And as he stood there, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, Tom realized something that had never occurred to him before: there was no going back. Not really. Once you saw the world through the eyes of those who had nothing, you could never unsee it. You could never return to your old life and pretend it didn't matter. Tom made his decision then. He wouldn't send the report. He wouldn't go back to the company. He would stay here, in the streets, where he had finally found something worth fighting for. Something real. The world had changed him, yes. But in that change, he had found his purpose. And with that realization, he took a deep breath and stepped forward into the unknown.